I had two choices in terms of what to do right now. I have a limited amount of time. I have a prepared talk that'll run at least 30 minutes. And I think you're the kind of audience that doesn't really need a prepared talk. And if you want, send me an email and I'll tell you where you can get a podcast of the last two talks I did on it yesterday. One 40 minutes long and one 30 minutes long, if you really want the whole 9 yards and don't want to buy the book. So what I'm going to do is talk about the book. And I think that you all will appreciate that, since I bet a lot of you write books or have written books or teach books to your students, or you understand how books are produced. This is a book that I have long been wanting to write, because I served for a little more than about 2 years as an advisor to the Palestinians who negotiated with the Israelis in Madrid and in Washington from 1991 to 1993. And in serving as an advisor to that delegation, we collected a huge body of documents. And the last book that Margaret mentioned, British Policy, was partly a study of Arab nationalism, but it was also partly a study of British policy. So in one respect, it was diplomatic history. And so I have that in my training as a historian, among other things. And I had here a store of documents that I wanted to use, and I never had a chance to use them. I couldn't think of a way to turn documents on a negotiation that never went anywhere, because we were undermined and later on gone around by the Oslo negotiating process that produced the 1993 Oslo Accords. And it was a graduate student who finally found for me the way to do this, or rather illuminated the path to writing this book, because he has been working on the Carter and Reagan administration's policies. His name is Seth Anziska. He's about to finish his dissertation at Columbia. And Seth worked in the Reagan Library at Simi Valley. He worked in the Carter Library in Atlanta. Can you hear me? Are you having... I don't know if this is amplifying or just recording. It's probably just recording. I'll do my best to project. And Seth came upon an extraordinary collection of documents, one of which just blew me away. It was an analysis by a CIA analyst named Redacted of what he expected Menachem Begin to do when President Reagan launched what was called the Reagan Plan on September 1st. So this was a late August 1982 document. This was in the wake of the 1982 war. Israel had launched an invasion of Lebanon in which 50,000 Lebanese and Palestinians were killed and wounded. It had finally been brought to a halt by a ceasefire on the 12th of August, the day after my daughter's birthday. She had a really terrible birthday, let me tell you, the day before, with the bombing going on. And the analyst wrote, "This is what Begin is likely to do and say." And I read that document and it just knocked me flat, because what that analyst said was not just, this is what Begin is going to say, no Palestinian state, and so on and so forth. I actually have the text of this, and I'm going to read it to you, because I think it really is astonishing. He said, the Accords guarantee that under no, in Begin's view, the Camp David Accords, which the Reagan plan was going to tweak, guarantee that under no condition can a Palestinian state be created. That was Begin's view. Under no condition, given the agreements Israel had signed with the United States and Egypt, can a Palestinian state be created. In practice, Begin effectively rules out any exercise of Palestinian self-determination, except one that continued Israel's preeminent position in the West Bank. And if you think about those words, self-determination and Israel's preeminent position in the West Bank, they don't go together. It's another example of what I call in this book the Orwellian language here. And I read this document and I said to myself, this is not just Begin's position. This becomes American policy. It's not just American policy. This becomes the outlines of the so-called self-government arrangement that's signed in Oslo. This is the Palestinian Authority. What Begin sets out at Camp David, what the CIA analyst brilliantly summarized in this memo, is what was imposed in the agreements that were ultimately signed, because of the weakness and foolishness, in my view, of PLO negotiators, but because of what I describe in the book as complicity between the United States and Israel. So this is what set me off, this document and the material that this student of mine found. And I realized that what we had gone through in Washington what we had collected all these documents working on, what we had discovered about American and Israeli complicity, in fact, perfectly echoed the work that he was doing on the Carter and Reagan administrations. And the same stuff was playing out on the TV screens as President Obama was being pushed back from his position that he took on settlements or on the borders for a prospective Palestinian state or on the urgency of the establishment of such a state. And I decided I'm not going to write a full-blown history of 1991-93. I'm going to write about 3 moments which are identical in that the United States takes a position and then pulls back from that position in the face of Israeli intransigence on the Palestine issue. And that was the genesis of this book. So the book has 3 chapters. It has a long introduction and 3 chapters. 1 chapter deals with this 1978 to 1982 period, ending with the Reagan plan. 1 chapter deals with the negotiations I was part of, 91, 93, and then the Oslo Accords. And the 3rd chapter talks about this president's policy in his first term. And I begin it with an epigraph from George Orwell, who I think sums up perfectly what I'm talking about in the deceitful way that the United States speaks about this issue. He says, "The slovenliness of our language makes it easier for us to have foolish thoughts. If thought corrupts language, language can also corrupt thought. A bad usage can spread by tradition and imitation, even among people who should know better." And what I argue in this book is that every single term used about the Middle East, peace process, honest broker, terrorism as it is used, and a whole Israeli security, each of these terms means something completely different. It has an Orwellian meaning. It is newspeak. It is not, self-determination is not self-determination, according to Begin and according to what was imposed, that continued Israel's preeminent position in the West Bank is not self-determination. If Israel is preeminent, then the Palestinians are not determining anything. Israel is determining. So it's Israeli determination of a Palestinian future. And it's that kind of distortion of language, that kind of corruption of what words mean or are supposed to mean, that, in my view, massively abets and aids what the United States is doing and conceals its real objectives. I describe it as conflict perpetuation. The United States is not even engaged in conflict resolution. I lay out in the book what I think would be the basis for a serious policy that would be directed at actually solving the conflict. You'd have to immediately end the occupation and Israel's control over Palestinians in the occupied territories. End it. Not negotiate its end. Not let the people with a military jackboot on its neck reach up and discuss with the person whose boot is on their neck how you end the boot on the neck situation. But rather say, this is an illegal occupation. It has to be ended. If we're going to have a resolution, the resolution has to involve immediate ending of that. And occupation is not just, the word. An Israeli journalist by the name of Amira Haas, who works for Haaretz, has described the way in which Israel controls the Palestinians as a matrix of control. It's not just checkpoints. It's not just searches in the dark of the night. It's not just thousands of Palestinians in prison. It's a whole net of data. Every individual in the occupied territories is in a database. You cannot have a child born, you cannot enter, you cannot leave without them fiddling with the data and making sure they know who you are, where you are. The so-called Palestinian Authority is an agency of the Israeli security system. They issue so-called passports. Those are passports that the Israelis decide on. Yes, he can have one. No, she can't have one. So this is security control, which in fact involves absolutely everything. This matrix of control. A real settlement would involve an end to this colonization enterprise, whereby more than half of the land in the occupied West Bank and East Jerusalem has been declared state land, and this state land is being used for public purposes, which only include the Jewish public. The 600,000 or so Israeli settlers who live in the occupied West Bank among 2.5 to 3 million Palestinians, a number that's growing, has grown from 200,000 when we went to Madrid to almost, as I've said, 600,000 today. All of these things would have to, and finally dealing with the refugee issue in a just and lasting manner. Doing those things would be a peace process. Doing what the United States is doing is just a process. which is directed, in my view, at avoiding fighting with Israel on the Palestine issue, and essentially pushing the can down the road. Now, when I'm asked about this, people often say, and Charlie Rose asked me the other night, do you really think they're deceitful? You know, he has that earnest way of asking a question. And you know, I didn't want to say this president is a liar and this president is a whatever, but yeah, I mean, the short answer to this is yes. When you use this kind of language to talk about something completely differently, you are engaging in deceit. And when you say, as I quote Secretary Rice in 2008, as saying, I don't want to hurt my role as an honest broker. This was in private talks with Palestinians. These documents, by the way, from those talks are available on the Al Jazeera and the Guardian websites under the title, I think, Palestine Papers. And you can read mind-boggling accounts of what was actually said between Palestinians and Israelis, some of the stuff that Zippy Livni said to the Palestinian negotiators, and some of the stuff that Secretary Rice said to the Palestinians. It's mind-boggling stuff. Similarly, in our negotiations in 1991, before we went to Madrid, the United States sent the Palestinians a letter of assurances. The assurances included the promise that the United States would act against things that were prejudicial or precedential to later negotiations. In other words, if somebody did something, either side, that would make it impossible to negotiate, that would prejudice the final outcome, which we were not allowed to negotiate with the Israelis. We were only allowed to negotiate interim self-government arrangements. Arab countries could negotiate peace. We couldn't negotiate those things. But if, in the interim, somebody did something that was prejudicial or precedential, the United States presumably was going to do something about it. That promise, of course, was never kept. In that letter of assurances, the United States says, or rather Secretary Baker, in whose name the assurances were issued, said, the United States will act as an honest broker. Well, that is a deceitful language. In doing the research for this book, I was reminded of why it is that the United States can't act as an honest broker. And this goes back to a letter that Secretary Kissinger had President Ford sent to Prime Minister Rabin in 1975. It was secret at the time. It's now public and available. And in it, the president basically told the Israeli Prime Minister that on the Palestine issue, and now I'm quoting from this letter, the United States would, quote, coordinate with Israel with a view to refraining from putting forth proposals that Israel would consider unsatisfactory. Think about that. The greatest superpower in world history was making anything it put forward on the Palestinian issue subject to Israeli approval, which meant that the Israelis and the Americans sitting at a conference table across from or with the Palestinians, this didn't apply to other issues, as I show in the book, were like Tweedledum and Tweedledee, because they'd already, beforehand, coordinated their positions, such that nothing the United States would say would be unsatisfactory to the Israelis. And that's an agreement that Israeli prime ministers, ever since Prime Minister Rabin, have doggedly held the United States to. Well, how can you be an honest broker if you've coordinated everything with one side? That's why they're lying when they say they're honest brokers. So, you know, if asked, could Khalidi possibly be saying that? Yes, that's what I'm saying. That's what I'm saying. I mean, either the United States is faithful to this commitment, which of course it could, as it has with many other commitments, like the commitments to the Palestinians, just tear up and throw away and ignore, and go ahead and proceed as states do in furtherance of their interests, or it can remain faithful to this commitment from 1975 and basically rule out the possibility of it being an honest broker. There are a couple other points that I make many points in this book. It's a very short book. It has a very long introduction and 3 relatively short chapters. It has a ton of footnotes. It has a lot of interesting stuff online. If any of you buy ebooks, you'll have live links to these things. I like real books, but you're free to do either way. And 15 of the documents that we generated or received during the 1991-93 negotiations, I have put up for anybody to access. You don't have to buy the book on the Institute for Palestine Studies website. I can give you the HTTP if you want. www.palestine-studies.org/ppd.aspx. You can get all 15 of these documents. I mean, it's a letter from Baker to Husseini, a letter from Yakim Rubinstein, the head of the Israeli delegation, to Dr. Haidar Abdeshefi, the head of the Palestinians. That's a bunch of documents. A lot of really great memos of meetings with the American diplomats. I mean, these are the most amusing of them all, for me. I mean, I had so much fun with these things, I have to tell you. There are two other things I say here that I think are really important. One of the takeaways people might have from some of the things I'm saying about the way American policy works on the Palestine issue is that the Israeli lobby is all-powerful, and it determines Middle East policy. Well, it plays a huge role in determining American policy on Palestine, and it always has. I go back to Truman, and I show how that's the case. But there are 2 points that have to be made. The first is, this is true about Palestine. It is not necessarily true about other things. And I go in great detail, even though it's antecedent to the purpose of the book, into a variety of cases where overwhelmingly important Cold War strategic advantage was to be achieved by the United States by forcing Israel to do things that Israel was absolutely unwilling to do. And again and again and again, they did it. The United States wanted a disengagement agreement in Sinai in 1974. It got it. And we have the documents now. We can read the furious objections of the Israelis. You can't read in the diplomatic documents the howlings of the lobby, but you can, imagine in your head. Same thing with the Golan disengagement agreement of the same year. Same thing with the 1975 second Sinai disengagement. Same thing with the Egyptian-Israeli part of Camp David in 78. Same thing with the 79 treaty. Whenever the United States perceived that major strategic advantage in an issue of great national importance to policymakers was at issue, Israel, lobby, they were there. They had an impact. They influenced outcomes, but they could not obstruct that line of policy. And that's an argument I make in respect to other things, arms sales to Saudi Arabia and so on and so forth. The second thing that has to be remembered is this, that while you have an Israel that's feisty in defense of its own interests, and while you have a lobby that is strongly committed to whatever the Israeli government of the day says, if the Israeli government of the day says the moon is made of green cheese, you will have a bunch of senators and congressmen and women who will put forward a law saying the moon is made of green cheese. They have a lobby that really is good. On the other side, what do you have in terms of the Arab countries? Well, the argument I make is that the Arab countries are like Sherlock Holmes's dog that did not bark, in the sense that you don't really have a counterweight. I go right back to Truman, and actually I go back to President Roosevelt, who met with Ibn Saud in 1945 on the deck of a warship in March on his way back from Yalta, and heard what the Saudi king said about Palestine, and in response to his concerns, wrote a letter just before he died in April of 1945, in which he said the United States would do nothing in Palestine to harm the interests of the Arabs, and the United States would be sure, before it did anything, to consult the Arabs. Now, immediately thereafter, Truman denied that any such letter existed and had to be shown by his State Department subordinates. Mr. President, I'm terribly sorry, you're wrong. President Roosevelt actually did send such a letter. But Truman ignored it, as have other American presidents. These are among the many promises to the Palestinians or over Palestine that the United States has not kept. The point is, there was no cost to the United States in terms of its relations with Saudi Arabia or most other Arab countries. And I go into this in great detail in the book. I'm not going to belabor the point here. But this is the sort of dirty secret of the American-Israeli relationship. It's not just Israel and the United States. It's not just this enormous cultural and religious and other matrix into which the politics and the diplomacy have to be fit. All of those things, it's not just the lobby. All of those things are very, very important. It's also the fact that on the other side, you do not have a counterweight. You have autocratic regimes lacking domestic legitimacy. The Arab world is the region of the globe with the lowest proportion of democratic regimes on Earth. Okay, well, Antarctica, but inhabited Earth. East Asia had despotic regimes. Southeast Asia had despotic regimes. South Asia had Latin America, East Europe. They've all begun to transform, not the Arab world until 2 years ago. And that is the secret here. You have regimes that have no domestic legitimacy. You have regimes that do not have to worry about their own public opinion, or if they do, it's, they play with it. And you have regimes which in many cases are pathetically dependent on the United States for regime security. In that circumstance, they are genetically, inherently incapable of putting any pressure on the United States. The only pressure that can be exerted in that relationship is by the United States on these weak, pliable, illegitimate autocracies. I mean, this is not rocket science. Turkey, during the last of our wars, declared wars, had just undergone a transformation, this is 2003, from a veiled military rule under some veil of democracy, and the control of everything important in Turkey by what the Turks call the deep state, to the AKP, the Freedom and Justice Party regime, which is still in power. As a result, when the Bush administration tried to push the Turks around the way it pushed everybody around, or tried to push everybody around, and said, we want to use Turkey as a transit point for sending troops into Iraq, Turkish military said, in Turkish, you're welcome. The Turkish government reluctantly said, yeah, okay, if you think so. And Turkish parliament refused to approve. The United States could not use Turkish territory. That's what a democratic government will do, or can do. I mean, it won't always do it, but that's what a democratic government can do. That's why Saudi Arabia, or Egypt under Mubarak, was, as I say, genetically incapable of standing up to the United States. And I think this is a very important part of understanding why on Palestine, an issue where there's a cottage industry in Washington that tells policymakers that it's not really strategically important for the United States, so you don't have to worry about it. On Palestine, the lobby has such salience, the Israel lobby. Israel's obduracy and intransigence has such salience, because Israel is a country where public opinion does matter. And governments do have to do, of course they can, as we may have noticed in our own country, a democratic government doesn't guarantee that governments don't try and brainwash their own people. Israelis are in some respects, like everybody else, in some measure brainwashed. But there is public opinion, there is a parliament, and you can't push Israel around in the same way you can push Saudi Arabia around, simply because you have to get it through the Knesset, as you had to get basing American troops in Turkey through the Turkish parliament. I mean, you can contrast that with Secretary Cheney going to Saudi Arabia and more or less forcing King Fahd to allow American troops to be based there in 1991. The monarchy was very reluctant to do that. And they were right to be reluctant. That's what turned bin Laden against them and against us. Once again basing American troops in Saudi Arabia in 1991. We removed our bases from there 15, 20 years earlier. And Cheney went there and he said, we have to have our bases here. The king had nobody he had to go to. There was no parliament. There was the rest of the royal family. And that was it. A bunch of other princes. And so Saudi Arabia made the fatal mistake of allowing the United States to base its troops there, and the rest was history. So these are the kinds of arguments that I'm making in this book. This is how I wrote the book. I wrote it in sort of a white heat because I really felt that this is an important argument to make. I find that the president's trip the other day to the Middle East reinforced every single argument I make about Obama in the third chapter. I think I was right on the money. One of the things I analyze in that chapter is every one of the president's major speeches on Israel, in which he has adopted, without missing a single note, a Zionist narrative of reality that could have been taken from the pages of Leon Uris's Exodus. I mean, he could have had strumming balalaikas behind him. And he could have had Paul Newman, acting out this nonsense. When he gave not just the speech in Jerusalem, and not just the AIPAC speeches, his General Assembly speech in 2012, speeches he's given to a variety of audiences. It's pitch perfect. It's exactly what they want to hear because it's how they've self-deluded themselves about the whole narrative of Israel's creation and relationship to Jewish history and existential danger. He mentions the existential danger Israel is in multiple times in every speech. This is a nuclear superpower that terrifies every country in its vicinity, okay, that has been in occupation of the Palestinians for 46 years, okay, that has bombed Arab capitals, bombed them, occupied Beirut. And there are reasons for this. This is not to say that there is not existential angst in Israel. It's just to say, do you reinforce this neurosis by repeating it? Or do you try and lure people away from it and say, yo, you have dozens, scores, perhaps hundreds of nuclear warheads. You have a military that has such cutting-edge technology, we spy on you to get your secrets. It's true, by the way. There's a wonderful piece in The Globalist by, I think, a former spook, in which he talks about how the CIA was spying on the Israeli station in South Africa to pick up on nuclear secrets that the Israelis were sharing with the South Africans. So that's what the book's about. I could go on and on and on, as you can see. I didn't give you a prepared lecture, for which I'm very, very happy. I've already given this damn thing twice in the last 48 hours. I don't think I'll give it again. And I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Well, I think you have a few.
We have about 25 minutes.
Yeah.
I have to sign books, but
Yeah.
after that I have to go.
Yes.
Okay.
Well, I'm going to say 25 till out the door.
Alrighty? No,
Well,
if the cab's
downstairs-
downstairs at 1:45.
Yeah, but I mean, you know,
Okay,
25 minutes
okay.
means
I have
20,
to say
you know,
goodbye to everybody, and
exactly.
that'll take some time.
Yeah, and walking down
Because
the
I mean, I
hall-
know a bunch of people here, and I do want to say goodbye to them.
I was there on a human rights delegation during the first Intifada.
In Palestine.
Yeah, to say the least, it was an amazingly moving experience,
Mhm.
just to share that. But a quick question, some friends are showing Paradise Now up in Media, Pennsylvania. They showed it yesterday. The Gatekeepers, if you've seen either of these movies.
I've seen them both.
Yeah, so if you could tell me what you think. And then finally, why did the Obama administration have conniptions over Palestine declaring itself a state in the United Nations?
Good question. Very briefly, I'll try. I tend to ramble in my answers, but I'll try and be brief. I saw Paradise Now at a pre-release screening a few years ago. It's actually a well-made film, but I don't think it's a good film on Palestine, frankly. I don't think it renders the occupation at all. By contrast, and I don't think it's a terribly good explanation of suicide bombing either. Because if you don't explain the occupation, you don't explain suicide bombing. Excuse me. I mean, that's my critique of the movie. The Gatekeepers is a masterful work, actually. And I think everybody should be forced to see it. I think they should be strapped into a chair and forced to see it. The Gatekeepers is an Academy Award-nominated film. Pardon me? Okay. And if you haven't seen it, you should see it. It's everywhere, thank God. It's made by an Israeli filmmaker by the name of Morey, I think is his last name. Yes. And it interviews the last 6 heads of the General Security Service, the Shin Bet. That is to say, the last 6 men who were responsible for running the lives of all Palestinians under occupation. So they know what they're talking about. And it's devastating what they say. It's absolutely devastating. It is not as good a film, however, wonderful though it is, as 5 Broken Cameras, which was made in Bil'in by a Palestinian with an Israeli producer, but it's a Palestinian who made it. That film is shattering. It's a brilliantly made film. It's a moving documentary, and it really tells you. The 2 films sort of fit together in a way. The one is from the occupation side, the other is from the occupied side. They're wonderful films. Another film you might consider seeing, which is available, I'm told, on Netflix, is the Law in These Parts, which is about Israeli military justice, another Orwellian term. Why did the president react as he did to Palestinian statehood? Because there was no countervailing pressure on him, and the Israelis raised holy hell. The Israeli government raised holy hell. Anybody in their right mind, including a friend of mine who's a rabbi in New York, said this is a good thing that the Palestinians have statehood. He got hell for it. He's still getting it. I spoke to him yesterday. Still getting hell for it. This is, any of you who are New Yorkers, Bnei Jeshurun. The 3 rabbis signed a letter in support of Palestinian statehood. Their board, to their enormous credit, supported them. But that's, I think, why he did it. It was a stupid move, of course, but, you know, there you are. Yes, ma'am.
In relation to your first point about the Reagan period,
Yes.
Jimmy Carter, in his recent books, has said that he believed the agreements did provide for the possibility of a Palestinian state, and that the Begin negotiated in bad faith. Do you think that Carter is lying?
No. No, the president is deluding himself. He did not read, I think, carefully this brief, which I am positive he saw. And this brief by this analyst that I quote almost the whole document in the book, said this is Begin's position, We, of course, don't have to agree with him. But in effect, the United States went along with it. That's my beef with the president. Whatever he thought Begin had done, he in effect went along with it. So I have to say that Jimmy Carter is one of a number of American policymakers. As some of you may have noticed if you read anything I've ever written or said, I'm not a big admirer of American foreign policy under most recent administrations. But Jimmy Carter is one of the people whom, frankly, along with Secretary of State Baker, I actually think in some respects was sincere in his concern on these issues. But read in the book what happened. Every American president since Carter, with the sole exception of George W. Bush, has actually tried to push the envelope on this issue and has been pushed back at and hasn't pushed back hard enough. Obama tried, Clinton tried, George H.W. Bush tried, even Reagan tried, even Ronald Reagan tried, and certainly Jimmy Carter tried. But they failed, and then they just zipped it until they left office when Carter tells us what he really thinks, which is great. Yes.
Yeah, two quick questions. Related to the pushback or the role of the Arab world, do you see any positive change?
Yes, I'm glad you asked that
And
question.
then the second one is, what do you think of the comments from Obama? Some people think his recent trip when he talked to the Israelis saying, you have to put yourselves in their shoes.
Right.
A big step forward.
Right. Second question first. The second part of the president's speech was good. Or the third of the president's speech where he told the Israelis, he tried to read a lesson to younger Israelis. I think it was actually good. The problem was he put it on top of the first half of the speech, in which he basically reinforced all the reasons why the Israelis won't listen to the second part of his speech. Yeah, it was good. He didn't hit a one right note with the Palestinians, however. And by adopting every single moldy, rotten old trope of the Zionist myth in the first part of his speech, he so alienated people that they really didn't appreciate the second part. And then he went to Ramallah, where most of the victims in this conflict, on the Palestinian side, where most of the victims are, and he talked in loving detail about an individual Israeli victim. I mean, at least have the courtesy when visiting people who are suffering, as you yourself have said in your own speeches, and talk about the suffering of some Palestinian girl. Or talk about an Israeli girl and a Palestinian girl. He comes and tells the Palestinians about Israeli girls who suffer. I mean, frankly, that's effrontery. And it was extremely poorly received. I mean, I can't tell you how poorly received. I mean, shoes being thrown at the president's picture was the least of it. You should hear the invective of people I've talked to. Pardon me? Well, that's the first question you asked, and that's very important. And that's something I talk about in the prepared talk, and I should have mentioned. The Arab world is a black hole where democracy is concerned compared to everywhere else in the world. And that's going to change sooner or later. And when it does, American policy will have to change. Now, how long it takes to change the Arab world is the problem. The entrenched autocracies are not going to go easily. They are reinforced by more money than you can imagine. And that's the problem. Think of Europe in 1848. Think of St. Petersburg and Vienna. And think of them on steroids fighting the revolution. Okay? Petro-billion steroids. Going to give them power that Washington will respond to one way or another, sooner or later. Yes, sir.
Do you see any, what do you make of what's going on in Israel right now internally? A friend of mine has been doing some good reporting on the increase of hate crimes.
Who's that?
Leah Tarachansky, she works with the Real News Network. The increase in hate crimes, particularly Israeli youth assaulting Palestinians.
In Jerusalem and places like that, yeah.
And also, the bus lines.
Right, the separate, segregated Rosa Parks bus lines, yes.
So what do you make of what's going on in Israel in the terms of the right, and especially is there any hope for internal change if it's not going to come from international diplomacy?
I'm not an expert on Israeli society. Let me start by saying that. I mean, unlike State Department, the types I dealt with at the top of the State Department, I don't pretend to know about things I don't actually know about. I mean, I think we have some very competent people in our government, but they don't tend to get promoted to the very top. And they don't take the political appointment jobs. They don't get them, unless they pretend to be something other than what they are. And so I can't give you a really, really learned answer to that. I can tell you, I agree with you, the trend is very disturbing. Overt racist actions are not just, something that happens on in a street in Jerusalem where a bunch of kids beat up some poor Arab. The Knesset is moving with laws that are really quite horrific. Now, whether they'll be passed, that's another issue. They may not be, but the fact that such laws are being put forward is really quite disturbing. Will Israel change? I think two things that might change Israel are this change that I talked about in response to the previous question in the Arab world. It may make them more paranoid and more fearful and more worried about existential issues, and therefore jackboot goes down harder on the neck of the Palestinians, but it may have another effect. Because a lot of insane Israelis argue that that means we have to change our approach. The second thing that might affect them is a change here or in Europe. Israel can't function without the support of the United States. It's a powerful country in its own right. It has a lot of independence in its foreign policy and so forth, but it can't function without the support of the United States. The system of exclusion and discrimination, I call it descending circles of hell, from Arab citizens of the State of Israel who have some rights but not vitally important rights, like no right to lease or buy land, most of which is owned by the state, Israel Lands Authority, Karen Kayameth, Jewish National Fund, exclusive property of the Jewish people, you can't touch it. All of it was Arab land, stolen from the Arabs, and they can't rent it. By law, I mean, that's a circle of hell down. But they're citizens and they can vote. Then you go to the residents of Jerusalem, further down. And then you go to the West Bank, and then you go to Gaza. No rights, bombed at will, can't leave, can't enter. I mean, that system, once it becomes known, is going to be intolerable to Americans. The day that the Palestinians develop a Madison Avenue instinct and can talk about Rosa Parks bus lines, you're not going to be able to get the majorities in the Senate and the House that you can get today. But that may be a process for, our children. I don't know. Yes, ma'am.
Do you think that there's really, I see a change with films like
Yes.
Makers, Ben Ehrenreich had that lead article.
Fabulous article.
Which was really good. And
Fabulous
by the way, a friend of mine who lives in Raphael Magnus just came back from Israel.
Yeah, I know them both.
They said to say hello to you, but anyway, they're so depressed with what's going on. I can't believe they are more depressed.
Let me answer
than
your
the
question.
reason they left.
Let me answer your question. I actually do believe the discourse in this country is beginning to change. And I think the things you pointed to are
J Street,
exactly the right signs. Jewish Voices for Peace,
right.
Students for Justice in Palestine,
Right.
BDS, Campaign to End the Israeli Occupation.
exactly.
None of this stuff existed 20 years ago.
Exactly.
I was talking with a couple of colleagues at lunch, and we all have the same realization, which is that our students consume media and different media than we did, or we do.
Right.
And they have access to stuff some of us, the smart ones amongst us, have access to it, or the savvy ones, technically savvy ones. They know more than we did, the smart ones.
Right.
And that is a sign, they go right around the obstacle to reality, which is the New York Times. They read 2 articles in the damn thing. They see The Daily Show. They don't watch network television. They see The Daily Show saying, network television is a huge stinking turd, avoid. That's all they need to know. Why watch Wolf Blitzer when you can see Wolf Blitzer being skewered? It's brilliant. They're smarter than we are. I mean, I give a lecture and I refer to something I saw in the Times. Most of you are teachers, I assume. You know when 10% of the class knows what you're talking about, the other 90% have no idea. That look. You mentioned the skit on The Daily Show the night before. Before you can finish describing it, they're laughing because they've already seen it. And it's not just The Daily Show. I mean, you can talk about 15 different sources. And just to say the last thing about this Ben Ehrenreich article. That article in the New York Sunday Times Magazine 2 weeks ago had more real reportage in one paragraph than the Times publishes in a 3-year period.
It was amazing.
There was more truth in one paragraph. Ben Ehrenreich, he's Barbara Ehrenreich's son, as it happens. And I met the father of the photographer yesterday by chance in Bethesda, but anyway, that's brilliant photographs. I mean, that's a sign of the beginning of the change. The change is we won't see it in some of you are very young and you know what I'm talking about. Those who are my age or around my age or a little older, younger, we won't see it from our generations. But the generation of my children and younger than my children in their 30s, and 10, 15 years younger, there's a big difference in the way even the ones who were committed Zionists, the way they approach this, completely different. So yeah, things will change. Yes, sir.
After the assassination of Ishaq,
Mhm.
the Israeli left went underground, basically.
Yeah.
They became a minority and they are being persecuted. And just recently, one of their leaders got elected. But I don't think the Israeli left is strong enough to be able to stand to the right and to the center. This is not a statement, sir. My question is there, I don't think this is a personal deceit from our politicians here, but what is the motive for deceit in this conflict? What is the motive? I don't think it's personal. That
No.
they want to deceive. So what's the true motive? What's the pressure that is making them kind of approach?
There is no overwhelming, immediate, short-term strategic advantage that they get from it. And there's enormous short-term pain that they would get from doing what most of them actually know is the right thing. So they don't do the right thing. I mean, I know that this president knows things that he just won't do as policy. And we know from President Carter's memoir that he knew things. I remember talking to Baker, and I've read Hanan Aishawi had much more extensive, and Faisal, Allah yarhamu, Faisal Husseini, had much more extensive talks with Baker than any of the rest of us. Baker was actually sympathetic. But that has nothing to do with it. It's not a personal issue. There's this world of pain that will be inflicted upon you politically by people who have no compunction about, kneecapping, low punches. They don't care. I mean, I was talking to a friend of mine, a rabbi at Bnei Jeshurun, the things that they do in order to make sure people stay in line, the mafia would be ashamed of. Okay? It's the dirtiest kind of politics. On the other side, there's no countervailing pressure. I mean, we know that Arab Americans in this country are largely a first generation. I don't know if any of you are American social historians or immigration historians. Arab Americans in this country, by and large, are not people like me. My mother came here in 1920. Most of them came here after our racist immigration laws were slightly de-racistized in 1965. So they're first generation, first and a half generation. Unlike almost every other hyphenated community in this country, which came here before those racist laws were enacted after World War I, they came late. And so they're not yet fully assimilated. My daughter's generation, my kids' generation, those are the ones who are going to law school. Those are the ones who are not ashamed of anything. Those are the ones who speak perfect English, know what the Constitution is, and they'll be damned if they'll take it. But they take time for that to be a counterweight. Maybe one more?
Yeah, one more.
One last question. Yes.
Could you talk a little bit about the situation in Gaza right now?
Yes.
And the relationship with Egypt and so forth?
Yeah, that's a complicated question, but a good question. The situation in Gaza is like the situation in all of Palestine, at least the parts occupied in '67, which is to say it is formally under occupation. I go to some length in one of the footnotes to show that even though Israel removed its settlements and redeployed its forces from Gaza, by international law and by also the estimation of State Department lawyers, it is still technically under occupation because Israel effectively controls Gaza. So it is an occupied territory even though Israel has redeployed its forces and removed all its settlers. And that conditions everything in Gaza. So that's the first condition. Entry, exit, and so on are under Israeli control. It's true that through Rafah people get out and come in, but only people, not goods. And it's not clear whether the Israelis are vetting them or not vetting them, as they used to coordinate with the Egyptians. It's not clear to me whether the Egyptians and the Israelis are not still coordinating entry and exit. So in any case, Israel controlled. Second thing is, Gaza is one of two territories controlled by warring, as we know, Palestinian authorities, neither of which, in my view, is serving the national interest, both of which are serving petty partisan or personal interests or the interest of their external sponsors. So the Palestinians have the unique problem in the Arab world of being a people not yet freed of colonialism and occupation, and who at the same time have the miserable results of a post-independence, corrupt, weak government. And they don't just have one, they have two of them. So they're really in a very bad way. And then more than half of the Palestinian population lives in exile, cannot return to its homeland. They're refugees or descendants of refugees. And that conditions the situation in Gaza. That's the framework. What is actually happening in terms of, I think you're asking about the relationship with Egypt. Yeah, well, in Egypt there's a struggle for power going on, with at least three corners to it. Four corners, I would argue. We've gone back to Egypt of the pre-52 period where the American embassy plays the role the British embassy used to play. So you have the Americans, you have the state and the military, you have the brotherhood, and you have the opposition. And in that interplay, the Palestinians are being trampled underfoot. My wife, my mother-in-law lives in Cairo and is an invalid. My wife goes there all the time. She was just there the other day. She came back. She said, "You can't believe some of the stuff that's being said about the Palestinians." I said, "What do you mean?" She said, the fuel crisis in Egypt is being described by the opposition as caused by the fact that the Muslim Brotherhood government is sending the fuel to Gaza. Outrageous lie. I mean, some fuel is going from Egypt to Gaza, but that's not the reason that. And so it's a political football in Egypt, and the Palestinians, again, are suffering as a result of it. The fact that the Brotherhood government is linked, ideologically to the Hamas government is actually a point of weakness for Morsi and the Brotherhood in Egypt. And so, I don't think that Egypt is going to be a source of a lot of strength for the Palestinians in the immediate future.
One
But-
last question.
Very quickly.
What should Palestinians do in the presence of these two corrupt misrepresentatives of the Palestinian people and the Palestinian cause?
They should demand that they dissolve the Palestinian Authority, and they should develop the kinds of civil society initiatives which have always been much more effective than anything the Palestinian State was able to do, except at maybe its height in the 70s, when the PLO really did represent until the 82 war, after which it pretty much disappeared. So things like BDS, things like these wonderful efforts that you'll see in 5 Broken Cameras, things like Students for Justice in Palestine, things like that. And telling these politicians that they do not represent and they should get out. The Palestinian Authority was an interim authority meant to be wrapped up, according to the letter of invitation by the superpowers to the Madrid Conference, in 1997. It's 16 years past its sell-by date. It didn't work. Shut it down. It serves as a prop for the occupation. That's what Palestinian security forces are trained and paid by the United States and with the assistance of Israel to do. The person who, this is the last thing I'll say, I gotta go. When we were negotiating, we were told that the PLO in May of 1993, PLO and Israel had come to a secret accord on security, whereby Israel had agreed to negotiate directly with the PLO, and in the context of that negotiation, it agreed to allow PLO forces to return to form the core of the security services. And we conveyed that to the Americans. I talk about it in the book. There's a memo, one of the documents. It's a really funny story. I won't tell you that story. The person who negotiated that on the Israeli side was Major General Shlomo Gazit, former chief of military intelligence, former coordinator of the occupied territories, i.e., he was the chief official in controlling the territories for years. A close confidant of Rabin, like Rabin, a general. And Rabin only felt comfortable with other generals. I was at a conference at Amherst College, and someone asked Gazit, after he had negotiated this agreement, yes, what about Arafat? And he was irritated. He said, Arafat, I can't imitate Gazit's a rumble. Lots of smoke. Oh. Arafat has a choice. He can be a Lahad or a super Lahad. General Antoine Lahad was the commander of the Israeli armed, trained, financed, and controlled South Lebanon army. That's how the Israeli security establishment envisages the Palestinian Authority. It should be dissolved. Thank you very much.